I had always been comfortable with solitude. My small cottage nestled deep in the woods provided the perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of the world. But one fateful night, as I sat alone in my home, I would discover that there are moments when the quiet of the night can become unbearably unsettling. The clock on my wall ticked steadily, the only sound in the otherwise silent room. Outside, the moon bathed the forest in an eerie silver glow, casting long, distorted shadows that danced on the walls. The gentle crackle of the fireplace was my only source of warmth and comfort as I settled into my favorite armchair, with a book in hand. The story I was reading was a chilling one, a tale of a lone traveler who found himself trapped in a remote cabin during a snowstorm. It was the perfect read for a night like this, a night when the wind howled through the trees, creating a symphony of eerie whispers. As I turned the pages, I couldn't help but become engrossed in the narrative. The words seemed to come alive, painting vivid images in my mind. I was so absorbed in the story that I almost didn't hear it. A soft, barely audible sound, like the creaking of a floorboard. I paused, my heart quickening, and listened intently. The room was silent once more, and I reasoned that it must have been a trick of my imagination. After all, I was alone in the woods, and the mind had a tendency to play tricks in the stillness of the night. I returned to my book, but a sense of unease lingered in the back of my mind. The sound had been real, of that I was certain. I tried to dismiss it as a result of the old house settling, but doubt gnawed at me. I continued reading, the words on the page blurring as my mind raced. It was then that I heard it again. A faint, unmistakable whisper. It was a whisper of words, too indistinct to make out, but the voice was chillingly close, as if someone were standing right behind me. I froze in my chair, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no denying it now. The sound was real, and it was coming from within my own home. I slowly turned my head, expecting to find someone there, a prankster or perhaps an intruder, but the room was empty. I stared into the darkness, my senses on high alert. The fire had dwindled to embers, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to come to life. The forest outside was still, the wind no longer howling. I was utterly alone. As I sat in the eerie silence, a feeling of dread settled over me. I couldn't explain the whispers, the unexplainable sounds that had invaded my sanctuary. Perhaps it was just my imagination, a result of the chilling story I had been reading. I decided to put the book aside and head to bed. The bedroom was at the end of a narrow corridor, and the journey there felt like a trek through a haunted house. Every creak of the floorboard sent shivers down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I finally reached my bedroom and climbed into bed, pulling the covers tightly around me. The room was cast in shadow, the only light coming from the soft glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. Just as I began to drift off to sleep, I heard it again, the whispering. This time it was clearer, the words forming coherent sentences, but they were spoken in a language I couldn't understand. The voice was haunting, filled with an otherworldly sadness. I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing. The whispers seemed to surround me, coming from all directions. I felt as though I were drowning in a sea of incomprehensible words, a symphony of despair that threatened to engulf me. I desperately searched the room for the source of the whispers, but there was nothing to be found. The walls seemed to close in on me, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I was trapped in my own home, a prisoner of the night. With a surge of fear, I leaped out of bed and raced to the door, throwing it open and stumbling into the hallway. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more insistent. I couldn't escape them, couldn't find their source. As I fled down the dark corridor, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadowy figure, fleeting and indistinct. It was there one moment and gone the next, disappearing into the darkness. I couldn't take it any longer. I burst through the front door and stumbled out into the moonlit night. The whispers seemed to fade as I put distance between myself and the cottage, and the forest around me felt eerily still. I never returned to that cottage in the woods.
Rain poured relentlessly, a ceaseless deluge that had persisted for days. It was the kind of rain that seemed to wash away the sins of the world, leaving everything cold, damp, and shrouded in mist. I found myself alone in the morgue on a night like this, a night that would haunt my dreams for years to come. I worked as the night watchman at the small-town morgue, a grim and thankless job that few would dare take on. The building itself was old and decrepit, hidden away on the outskirts of town. It was a place of eerie silence and chilling isolation, where the only sounds were the soft hum of the refrigeration units and the patter of rain against the windows. The night had been uneventful, like so many before it. I had spent the hours poring over paperwork, my only company the silent occupants of the cold storage drawers. But as the clock ticked closer to midnight, a sense of unease settled over me, a feeling that I couldn't shake. I tried to dismiss it as the product of my overactive imagination, the result of long hours spent in the morgue's dimly lit corridors. But then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a soft sigh or a whisper on the wind. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, and strained to listen. The morgue was supposed to be empty at this hour, devoid of the living, but the sound came again, a chilling breath that seemed to linger in the air. With a trembling hand, I reached for the flashlight on my desk and stood up. The morgue was dimly lit, with narrow corridors flanked by rows of stainless steel drawers. The overhead lights buzzed softly, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. I began to make my way through the rows of drawers, my flashlight casting a feeble beam of light that seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. The rain continued to drum against the windows, a steady and hypnotic rhythm that added to the sense of foreboding. And then, as I turned a corner, I saw her, a figure standing at the far end of the corridor. She was shrouded in darkness, her features obscured, but I could feel her eyes on me, watching, waiting. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no reply, only the oppressive silence that seemed to hang in the air like a shroud. I took a hesitant step closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. As I approached, I could make out more details of the figure, a woman dressed in a flowing white gown that clung to her like a shroud. Her long hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her skin was pale and translucent, as if she were a ghost. I stopped a few feet away from her, my heart pounding. "Are you lost? How did you get in here?" She did not answer, but her eyes seemed to bore into me, a deep well of sorrow and despair. Her lips moved, forming words that I couldn't hear over the rain outside. Without warning, she turned and glided down the corridor, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, stunned and bewildered, my flashlight illuminating the empty space where she had been. With trembling hands, I followed her, unable to resist the inexplicable pull she had on me. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, the flickering lights above casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to reach out and grab at me. I finally reached the end of the corridor and found myself in a small, dimly lit room. The woman stood in the center, her gaze fixed on a table that held a single body covered by a white sheet. I watched in horror as she reached out and slowly pulled back the sheet, revealing the face of the deceased. It was my own face, my own lifeless body lying there on the table. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling in disbelief. It was impossible, inconceivable. I was still alive, standing here in this chilling room. But the woman's eyes never left my face, her expression filled with a mournful longing. And then, as I watched in horror, her features began to change, shifting and contorting until she looked exactly like me, a perfect mirror image. She reached out toward me, her hand cold as ice. I turned and fled from the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The corridors seemed to twist and turn, the morgue itself becoming a labyrinth from which there was no escape. The rain outside had intensified, its relentless drumming now a cacophony that echoed through the morgue's narrow halls. I finally burst through the front door, gasping for breath, and stumbled out into the pouring rain. The night was dark and stormy, the world outside a blur of shadows and mist. I had escaped the morgue, but the memory of that ghostly figure, that doppelganger of my own face, would stay with me forever. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that the morgue holds secrets that should never be unearthed, that the rain-soaked night had brought something to life, something that should have remained in the realm of the dead. The memory of that night and the ghostly figure that haunted me will forever be a chilling reminder that some mysteries are best left buried in the dark.
I had been a delivery boy for years, traversing the labyrinthine streets of the city, delivering food to hungry customers at all hours of the day and night, but nothing could have prepared me for that fateful night, a night that would haunt my dreams forever. It was a particularly chilly evening, the streets empty except for the occasional passerby hurrying to find shelter from the biting cold. The clock on my bike read 11:45 p.m. as I pedaled through the dimly lit neighborhood. The aroma of freshly cooked food wafting from the container streped to my back. My destination was an address I had never been to before, a place tucked away in a part of the city that seemed untouched by time. The buildings here were ancient, their facades weathered and crumbling. I reached the address, a dilapidated apartment building, and chained my bike to a lamppost. The entrance was a shadowy alcove, barely lit by a flickering overhead bulb. I hesitated for a moment, my breath visible in the cold air, before summoning the courage to ring the buzzer. A crackling voice responded, "Hello, who's there?" "It's your food delivery," I replied, my voice wavering slightly. The voice on the intercom buzzed with static. "Finally, come on up to the 5th floor." The door buzzed, and I pushed my way inside, the old building's interior even more decrepit than its facade. The stairwell was dark, and the walls seemed to close in around me as I ascended to the 5th floor. The hallway was poorly lit, with peeling wallpaper and an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. I found the apartment and hesitated for a moment before knocking. A shiver ran down my spine as I waited for a response. Then, with a creak, the door swung open, revealing a dimly lit room and a figure standing in the shadows. The person who greeted me was a woman, but her features were obscured by the dim light. She was dressed in a long, tattered robe that seemed out of place in the modern world. Her voice was cold and monotone as she said, "Leave the food on the table." I did as she asked, setting the bags of food down on a rickety table near the entrance. The room was sparse with faded wallpaper and a single flickering candle casting eerie shadows on the walls. It felt like I had stepped into a different era, a place untouched by time. As I turned to leave, the woman spoke again. "Wait. I need something else from you." My heart quickened, and I turned to face her, the flickering candlelight revealing her face. Her eyes were hollow, her expression devoid of emotion. In her hand, she held a small, ornate box. "What do you need?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I need you to deliver this," she said, handing me the box. "Take it to the old cemetery at the edge of town. Leave it there and do not open it under any circumstances." I wanted to refuse, to run from that place, but something in her eyes held me captive. Without thinking, I accepted the box and rushed out of the apartment, my heart pounding in my chest. The old cemetery was a desolate place, hidden away at the edge of town. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, and the only light came from my bike's headlamp. I pedaled through the winding paths, the tall, looming tombstones casting long shadows. I reached the spot the woman had described and placed the box on a crumbling grave. The air was still, and an eerie silence hung in the darkness. I couldn't help but wonder what was inside the box, what kind of strange ritual I had unwittingly become a part of. Just as I turned to leave, a bone-chilling scream echoed through the cemetery. freezing me in my tracks. It was a scream of pure agony, a sound that sent terror coursing through my veins. I couldn't pinpoint the source, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. My instinct screamed at me to flee, to get as far away from that place as possible. But the box still sat on the grave, untouched. I had a sickening feeling that my task was not yet complete. With trembling hands, I picked up the box and opened it. Inside, I found a single, blood-red rose, its petals glistening in the dim light. As I gazed at the flower in horror, the ground beneath me began to tremble, and the tombstones around me seemed to come to life, their shapes contorting and shifting in the darkness. I fled from the cemetery, the sound of unearthly wails and eerie whispers following me. The woman's warning echoed in my mind. Do not open it under any circumstances. But it was too late. I had unleashed something malevolent, something that should never have been disturbed. I raced back to my bike, my heart pounding, and pedaled away from that accursed place as fast as I could. The moon emerged from behind the clouds, casting an eerie glow on the darkened streets. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pursued, that something sinister was trailing me. As I reached the safety of the well-lit city streets, I couldn't help but wonder what I had unwittingly unleashed, and what horrors awaited me in the days to come. The memory of that night would forever haunt my dreams, a reminder that some deliveries should never be made, and some boxes should never be opened.
It was a night like no other, with rain pouring relentlessly from the heavens. Thunder rumbled ominously in the distance, and flashes of lightning briefly illuminated the world around me. Despite the storm, my friend Jake and I were determined to make the most of our fishing trip. We had heard stories of the legendary catfish that prowled the depths of Blackwater Lake, and we couldn't resist the temptation to try our luck. Armed with raincoats, fishing gear, and an old lantern, we set out in Jake's rickety boat, casting off from the dock into the inky blackness of the water. The rain fell in torrents, drenching us to the bone, but our excitement spurred us on. The boat rocked gently with the rhythm of the rain, and the only sound that punctuated the downpour was the occasional distant rumble of thunder. We were the only ones on the lake, or so we thought. As we drifted further from the shore, I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. A dim, flickering light danced in the distance, obscured by the heavy rain. I pointed it out to Jake, and we both strained our eyes to see what it was. "It's probably just another boat," Jake said, trying to dismiss the unease in his voice. But as we got closer, it became clear that it was no boat. It was a lantern, suspended in midair, bobbing above the water's surface. There were no hands holding it, no visible source of light, just a disembodied lantern glowing eerily in the stormy night. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt a knot of unease in my stomach. This was no ordinary fishing trip, and we were no longer alone on the lake. The lantern led us deeper into the heart of the storm, its pale light beckoning like a siren's call. We followed it, unable to tear our eyes away, and soon we found ourselves in the middle of the lake, surrounded by darkness on all sides. The rain had intensified, and the lantern's glow became the only source of light in the world. As we drifted further into the inky abyss, I became acutely aware of an oppressive silence. The sound of the rain had disappeared, and the only thing I could hear was the rhythmic sloshing of the oars in the water. It was as if we had entered a different realm, a place untouched by the storm. And then, I heard it. A soft, haunting melody that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. It was a song, a mournful tune that sent shivers down my spine. I turned to Jake, but he too had heard it, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Yeah," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's coming from the water." The melody grew louder, the notes weaving together in a haunting refrain. It was as if the very lake itself was singing to us. I leaned over the side of the boat, peering into the water, but there was nothing to be seen, just an impenetrable darkness. We tried to row away to escape the eerie melody, but it followed us, growing louder and more insistent with every stroke of the oars. Panic began to claw at the edges of my mind, and I knew we had to get out of there. As we rowed furiously, the lantern that had led us there suddenly went out, plunging us into total darkness. We were adrift in the middle of the lake, surrounded by an otherworldly silence and the haunting melody echoed all around us. I grabbed the lantern we had brought with us, desperately trying to relight it, but it remained stupidly dark. It was as if the very air had been snuffed out, leaving us in a void of nothingness. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the melody stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and we sat in the boat, trembling and disoriented. We had no idea where we were or how to get back to shore. With great effort, I managed to light our lantern once more, and its feeble glow revealed a sight that sent a jolt of terror through my heart. The lake around us was teeming with shadows, murky figures lurking just beneath the surface. They swirled and darted, their eyes gleaming with malevolence. I could see Jake's face pale in the lantern's light, as he too saw the creatures that surrounded us. Without a word, we both began to row with all our might, desperate to escape the nightmarish lake and the haunting melody that had ensnared us. But the shadows beneath the water followed us, their movements growing more frenzied and aggressive. I could feel their cold, clammy hands brushing against the sides of the boat, trying to pull us under. We rowed on, our strength waning, the lantern flickering ominously. Just when it seemed like we could row no more, the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, casting a feeble light on the lake. With a final burst of effort, we reached the shore, collapsing onto the muddy bank, gasping for breath. The shadows in the water retreated, vanishing into the depths. The rain had stopped and the storm had passed, leaving us shaken and terrified. We never spoke of that night again, and we never returned to Blackwater Lake. The memory of the haunting melody and the lurking shadows still haunts my dreams, a reminder that there are things in this world that should never be disturbed. The rain came down in torrents, obscuring my vision as I navigated the winding road that led to St. Agnes's convent. The ancient building stood atop a lonely hill, a looming silhouette against the stormy sky. I had been summoned there as a historian to catalog the convent's archives, a task that should have held no peril. But from the moment I arrived, an ominous feeling had settled in my chest. I stepped out of my car, the rain pelting me mercilessly, and made my way up the cracked stone path that led to the convent's entrance. The heavy wooden doors creaked open, as if beckoning me inside. The foyer was dimly lit, the flickering candles casting eerie shadows on the faded portraits of long-dead nuns that adorned the walls. Sister Mary, the convent's last living occupant, greeted me with a smile that did little to hide the exhaustion in her eyes. She led me through the labyrinthine corridors, the floorboards groaning beneath our feet, to the small room that would serve as my workspace. The archives were a treasure trove of history, filled with centuries-old manuscripts, diaries, and letters. As I delved into the documents, I uncovered a disturbing pattern. Each entry, written by a different noon over the years, spoke of strange occurrences, whispers in the night, shadowy figures in the hallways, and an overwhelming sense of dread that permeated the convent. Sister Mary, a woman of few words, confessed that she had experienced these phenomena herself. She spoke of sleepless nights plagued by chilling whispers in Latin and dark figures that seemed to follow her through the convent. Her pallor and haunted expression bore witness to the horrors she had endured. As I worked late into the night, the storm outside grew more intense, the wind howling like a mournful wail. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone in the convent. I heard faint footsteps in the hallway, the soft rustling of robes, and a chilling voice that whispered my name. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no reply, only the oppressive silence that seemed to hang in the air like a shroud. I tried to dismiss my unease as the product of an overactive imagination, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Days turned into weeks, and my research uncovered a dark history that had been buried beneath the convent's holy facade. It seemed that St. Agnes's convent had once been a place of great suffering. Nuns accused of heresy had been imprisoned within its walls, subjected to unspeakable tortures. One name in particular appeared repeatedly in the archives: Sister Beatrice. She had been accused of consorting with demons and was said to have possessed unnatural powers. Her fellow nuns had turned on her, subjecting her to brutal interrogations and exorcisms. As I delved deeper into Sister Beatrice's story, I began to feel a malevolent presence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. I would wake in the dead of night, bathed in cold sweat, with the sensation of icy fingers closing around my throat. One evening, as I pored over Sister Beatrice's diary, I felt a sudden, overwhelming compulsion to visit the convent's crypt. It was as if an invisible force was drawing me there, urging me to uncover the truth. I grabbed a lantern and made my way through the darkened corridors. The crypt was a cold, damp chamber filled with row upon row of stone coffins. I shivered as I scanned the names etched into the lids. And then I saw it, Sister Beatrice's name, carved into a weathered tombstone. My heart pounded as I lifted the lid, revealing a sight that would haunt me forever. Sister Beatrice's body lay there, perfectly preserved, her eyes open and filled with a malevolent light. Her lips moved, forming words in a language I could not understand. The air grew frigid, and I could see my own breath as I backed away in terror. "Release me," Sister Beatrice's voice echoed in my mind.
Please.
"Release me from this cursed place." I stumbled backward, dropping the lantern, and fled the crypt in a blind panic. The oppressive presence seemed to follow me, growing more powerful with each step. I could feel Sister Beatrice's anger and desperation, her desire for vengeance against those who had condemned her. As I burst into the hallway, I was met with a horrifying sight. Sister Mary, her eyes black as coal, standing before me. Her voice, no longer soft and gentle, was filled with a sinister authority. "You have awakened her," she said, her voice sending a chill down my spine. Sister Mary's body contorted in unnatural ways as she advanced toward me, her fingers elongating into gnarled, skeletal claws. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and fell to the floor. In that moment of terror, I remembered a passage I had read in Sister Beatrice's diary. The key to banishing the malevolent spirit lay in the consecrated ground of the convent's chapel. With the last of my strength, I dragged myself to my feet and sprinted toward the chapel. The chapel was a place of sanctity, a refuge from the darkness that had consumed the rest of the convent. I could feel Sister Beatrice's presence close behind me, her anger and desperation growing stronger with each step. As I crossed the threshold into the chapel, I could hear her voice screaming in my mind, a cacophony of rage and torment. I stumbled to the altar and fell to my knees, reciting the sacred words of exorcism I had found in the archives. The chapel seemed to tremble with a powerful force as Sister Beatrice's malevolent presence was expelled from the convent. The storm outside raged on, but the darkness that had plagued St. Agnes's convent for centuries was finally banished. Sister Mary, her eyes returned to their natural state, helped me to my feet. She thanked me, her voice filled with gratitude, and I knew that the convent was finally free from the haunting presence of Sister Beatrice. I left St. Agnes Convent forever changed, the memory of that night etched into my soul. The darkness that had once consumed the convent was gone, but the horrors I had witnessed would stay with me for the rest of my days. Sister Beatrice's malevolent spirit had been banished, but the scars it had left behind would never truly heal.